Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks, Daniel, for the thumbs up. My name is Alice Rios-Shaw. It's good to see all of you here this morning. I am project lead in the Dallas College Human Resources Professional Development Department, and we welcome you to this breakout session as part of today's Sustainability Summit. So glad you're here. I want to move on to our guest speaker. Daniel is here with us, Daniel Cunningham. He is a horticulturist with Texas A&M's AgriLife's Water University program. Daniel provides professionals as well as the public with the most current research-based information on resource efficiency and water conservation landscape management. He's focused on a holistic approach, and Daniel specializes in native plants, edible landscaping, rainwater harvesting, and the utilization of landscapes as habit for beneficial wildlife. You can keep up with Daniel, by the way, by following his @TX Plant Guy, @Texas Plant Guy social media pages, and by catching his latest articles in the Dallas Morning News, Edible DFW segments on NBC Channel 5, or you can also hear Daniel on 95.3 The Range. Love The Range, Daniel. Tips on how to get the most out of your lawn, landscape, or vegetable garden. So without further ado, we bring you Daniel Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you for everyone joining us this afternoon. So I guess it's not afternoon yet, this morning. I wanted to focus on some of the hottest trends that we've seen in landscape design. Every few years, the American Society of Landscape Architects does a questionnaire basically asking designers what their clients are looking for in a landscape. In the past few years, we've seen an increase in interest in landscapes that are environmentally sustainable, landscapes that reduce water cost, and landscapes that are lower maintenance. So we see that both with the baby boomer generation as well as millennials transitioning towards landscapes and more time enjoying. Of those surveyed, 83% are interested in native or adapted drought-tolerant plants, low-maintenance landscapes, like we said, drip efficient irrigation, which helps with that low maintenance as well as saving water, reduced lawn area, food and vegetable gardens is one that has really not only been the past few years, but it's boomed over 6 more people have been finding that hobby due to the pandemic. And with food and vegetable production, certainly people are more interested in rainwater harvesting, doing organic practices in their landscape, and then utilizing compost for the many benefits that it has in the landscapes. Now, unfortunately, there are some challenges to growing plants in Texas, whether that is heat. Certainly, it's something that we've had to deal with this summer, and soil temperature. The right amount of sunlight. When we talk about growing food, certainly sunlight is one of the challenges, especially with folks that have mature trees on their properties. Weeds compete with our plants for not only sunlight, but also water and nutrients. But we'll talk about some weeds are things that people call weeds that are edible and nutritious in our landscape. And then certainly pests can be a problem, whether those pests are diseases or weeds themselves, or perhaps insects that create some challenges. And then one of the growing issues, and a growing issue in more ways than one, it's typically the most limiting factor to plant growth, is water. But because of population growth, it's becoming more and more of a challenge here, not only in north central Texas, but in our state as a whole. If we look at the U.S. drought monitor over Texas, we can see that in the past few years, it's kind of feast or famine. That exceedingly excessive rainfall, and then areas that have drought where we're seeing less than 50% of our average rainfall. And really that combination with that rapid growth, now in north central Texas, we're not only one of the fastest growing areas in the state, but one of the fastest growing areas in the country, which means we have limited water resources to meet that rapid growth. So we have to figure out how to do more with less water. But many times, especially during the growing season in the summer months, we see an excess of 50 to 60% of our water consumption tied up into outdoor water use. So one thing we can do is reduce our turf areas. Typically, turf grass is going to have higher demands in terms of water use, but also maintenance, fertilizer, different amendments that you would put on that. And so if we can keep about a third of our landscape turf grass, but take over some of that turf grass area with native and adapted perennials, certainly these can be edible plants as well. And then about a third of our landscape should be made up of pervious hardscape. We see pervious, that is areas that are pathways and patios, maybe borders or edgings that are able to infiltrate water. So when it does rain, those can soak up that water, and that will kind of help hold us, tie us over until we get the next rainfall event. Now, a lot of times when we talk about native and adapted plants, folks initially want to think that we're talking about a landscape that you would see in Arizona or New Mexico or somewhere in a desert cone area with cacti and yucca and rocks in the landscape. But we want to show people that here in north central Texas, we can have native and adapted landscapes that incorporate food plants, other edible plants that not only are drought tolerant and heat tolerant, but because they're better adapted to our area, they're going to typically use less water, less fertilizers, less pesticides. Certainly plants that are native, those are hardy, those are adapted to our sometimes harsh and unpredictable climate, are sometimes challenging soil types. And then there are many adapted plants that they're not native here, indigenous to Texas, but they are indigenous to areas that have similar weather patterns and rainfall soil types that we have here. So what I would encourage folks to do today is to think about how they can use the information provided to give their landscapes a little jolt of life. And we do that with what we call landscape CPR. The C in CPR is conservation. So we want to save resources like water, soil, energy. We can also improve air quality by using these practices and preserve and enhance the habitat that we do have, and then using our landscapes to help improve the ecological functions that land once had. Now, one way we can do that is by increasing permeability. A lot of times in urban areas, we have problems with stormwater, and that's because we've created houses and parking lots and driveways and all these areas where when water drops hit, they kind of go with the path of least resistance. And so, because it can't infiltrate into our soil like it once did when this area was short grass or mixed grass prairie, then it causes flooding problems, and that stormwater eventually ends up in our lakes where we get our drinking water from, and it picks up all the pollutants that are coming out of our commercial and residential landscape. So if we can disconnect those impermeable or impervious surfaces, breaking them up, allow water as much as possible to spread out and sink into the ground, then we're going to be doing better off. We're going to use less water, and we're going to protect the water that is heading to our local water bodies, whether that's a nearby creek or a river or, again, a man-made lake. Another way we can do that is by creating soil that is biologically active. It's going to hold on to water. Anytime we add organic matter or mulch on top of our soil, that helps more water infiltrate when we do see rainfall events or when we're supplementally irrigating with our irrigation system. But also it works like a sponge, and it holds that moisture into the soil where those roots can take advantage again till we get our next rainfall event. Really, the R is all about retention. We want to be greedy with our water, whether we're holding it in the soil or perhaps in cisterns, or we're using that and using drip irrigation or soaker hose. And that is going to not only benefit our soil, but also our plant and then our region and the habitat as a whole. Anytime we can reduce that runoff and grade to capture water and allow it to sink into the landscape. Now, those are some of the trends that we've seen in the past few years. The trends that we're seeing right now in 2020 definitely include food. You may have seen this make local and national news. Really just an uptick in folks that since we've been in the pandemic, certainly I think when we first got started here in March, there were grocery stores that had limited fresh produce. And so folks are really saying, hey, we need to grow some of our food on our property, and maybe we can increase our food access that way. Also, we've seen record numbers. Some of our largest seed producers were in a shortage because people were buying seeds to start vegetable gardens themselves. And there was just a limited amount of kind of stock seed for growing vegetables, which was a challenge. We've also seen this past year people get more interested in pollinator-friendly landscapes. Certainly, pun intended, monarchs are royalty of butterflies in Texas, but people are creating landscapes that give back to bees, whether those are honeybees or European bees or our native pollinators as well as, variety of different pollinators. It could be beetles like fireflies, a variety of different hummingbirds and other animals and insects that are kind of accidental pollinators. There's also a trend to more mini meadows or perennial plantings mixed with annual plantings. We call them kind of micro prairies. These are plantings that have a more wild look but create kind of a habitat using our native plant material. We'll talk more about that kind of going forward. Each year we see trends. Pantone does a color of the year, and this year the color was blue. We've also seen an uptick in plants that have the color gray, whether that's in their foliage or in the blooms themselves. We'll talk about some plants that incorporate those. And then the other trend is plants that do double duty. So there are plants that taste great, or plants that look great and are water efficient, but they happen to provide habitat for wildlife. There's also a lot of different functions that those plants may have, whether that's inside the home, on our dinner table. And so you don't have to just pick one. In fact, in my landscape, really, yes, plants have to tick off a few different criteria before they opt in my home landscape. Now, let's start talking more about growing their own food. We've seen 35% of Americans now are growing their own food. That's the highest number we've seen in decades, 42 million households. And the recent data, I really want to see that because I think we're really going to jump past numbers. A couple of years, we've seen a 63% increase in edible gardening for millennials. So it's really neat to see the uptick in the baby boomers as well as the millennials, connecting those two generations together. Which sometimes fight on social media. You see the damn millennials, and then you hear them talk about okay boomer, but there's really a lot in common with that, which is really kind of uplifting. People see growing food as a solution to social and environmental issues, food waste issues. I wrote an article this past year in Edible DFW magazine, and you can find that just by searching Edible Dallas Fort Worth. But up to 90% of our food scraps end up in landfills, and really that's becoming a growing problem. Food security issues. So I'm currently working on an article for Edible DFW that will come out this winter, but it touches on food deserts and the challenges associated with food scarcity here in North Central Texas. Food transport miles. So a lot of times our food travels, over 1,000 store. There's a lot of fossil fuels and natural resources that are tied up there. So we can buy local, if we can grow local, we can reduce that. And then there's wasted water. I'll talk about that more, depletion of arable land, especially in urban areas where we don't have as much access to growing our own food on that property. In fact, agriculture is responsible for 80% of all of our water consumed. And in Texas, growing our food makes up about 2/3 of our water footprint. And then if any of that food is wasted, and really a big chunk of our water is not actually going to be affected. So one way that we can do that is by switching out some of our ornamental plants in our landscape for food plants. And so I like to call that the practical integration of food plants. We're going to use the same ornamental design principles. We're just going to substitute those otherwise unproductive plants for edible plants. And I'll talk about some specifics. I like to call that stacking functions with multiple use plants. Like I said, plants as a horticulturalist, plants in my neighborhood have to look great. Of workers, I tried to live in my neighborhood and be incognito. My wife told people what I do and work for the state as a horticulturist, so now I get questions and I also get judged. And we're working on that. Plants that look great but also taste delicious. Selfishly, I want plants that give back to me, but also plants that give back to pollinators. So if I can plant something that is going to attract a butterfly or a bee. In fact, I have a 17-month-old daughter, and we have plant books and books that talk about butterflies and bees. And this morning, I was working on my presentation, and she points to the screen and says bee, and then she points to the screen and says butterfly. And it's so neat that we get to see that out in the landscape. And then when I'm doing, also recognizes those plants. Certainly, we want plants that are going to save water. Not only does that help reduce our water bill in the summer, it also just makes us better stewards of that natural resources. And then there are some other beneficial uses around the home and garden, and I promise I'll dig into that more. Edible plants can be used for low hedges. They can be used for borders, kind of plants that are low growing along the walkways. We can see some in this picture. They can also be background plants that really give kind of a backdrop for some of our flowers and plants that have interest foliage. And you have an empty space to fill. Maybe you try and put the right edible plant in that right spot. Certainly edible plants can thrive in spots. Some of them can do the part shade to full shade, but that's a little bit more challenge. We have to kind of think outside the box when we think about shade-tolerant edible plants. And edible plants can be grown for their edible flowers, the flavor of their leaves, or perhaps even their scent. I did some creeping thyme and some rosemary along the path where I go to take out the trash. And so normally when you take out the trash, you smell the trash bag, of course, with all their diapers in there. And so if you're walking by those herbs and you kind of imparts some of those floral scents and herbal scents in the air, then that's kind of working multifunction. And let's talk about some edible trees that you may want to consider planting. In fact, today is Texas Arbor Day, so what better way? I'm actually going to go after this, go plant some. But what better day to plant trees than a good time to plant both our ornamental trees, shade trees, as well as these edible fruit trees. Pomegranates do really well in full sun. They do require well-drained soil, but a delicious, highly ornamental plant that is really kind of a symbol of the holidays that we're going into. Persimmons, like yesterday, I spent the day harvesting some persimmons. I have a dwarf persimmon on my property. These are Japanese persimmons, but if you let these ripen fully, they taste like a cross between a mango, kind of honey custard, kind of a little bit citrusy, just delicious, delicious plants. There's also a native version of those. I have a loquat. The loquats are blooming now, which are great at attracting pollinators. They also are going to produce fruit over the winter, but typically it's only every year, 2 years, 3 years that they do this because they bloom during the winter time. And so if we get a really hard freeze, you may not get fruit, but an evergreen foliage on this plant that looks very similar to like a magnolia on the foliage. I have some elderberries growing in my backyard, and these are blooming, and then they give us the elderberries, which a lot of people like for their edible value in syrups that folks feel like they help them get past the flu or the cold, but also their umbel, big clusters of white, sweet-smelling flowers are very attractive to a number of pollinators, and these are actually native to our area. There are other versions and non-native versions that actually have really deep kind of purple foliage and pink flowers. These are not going to be as productive in terms of fruits, but still provide habitat for pollinators or nectar source. Nanking cherries, one of my neighbors has a lot of these growing on the property, but this is more of a shrubby plant. It's in the prunus family, so like our peaches and plums. This is one of the easiest cherries that we can really grow here, and smaller cherries that are stemless, but fantastic for a number of pollinators when they're blooming in the spring, and then you get to enjoy these fruits. The goji berries, I saw these for sale at a local nursery that had 20 or so of these, but fantastic, high in lycopene, is a nitrogen fixer. You can dry these and kind of sweeten them a little bit and use these just to snack on or in various recipes. But goji berry is an edible shrub whose flowers it's related to our wolfberry, and so a lot of pollinators use those similar type flowers. You can also incorporate showy herbaceous edibles, whether those are artichokes, beet, kales, beans, Swiss chard, peppers, eggplants, lettuces. Sunchoke is a native edible sunflower. Sweet potatoes folks are harvesting right now. Asparagus looks great this time of year with the fern type foliage, and then of course you can harvest that in the spring and the fall. Arugula, a lot of these plants you can incorporate through the landscape, and then you're more sustainable because you are utilizing water and fertilizer to kind of keep these going. But if you're taking over some of your landscape, then those resources are actually going to be more effective than if you were growing just turf grass or just strictly ornamental flowers. You can also, a lot of our earth Basil, it's time to harvest that before we get a freeze and do some pestos. Apple sage is an awesome perennial flower. You can use the leaves and the flowers that have a pineapple taste. We've got a lot of ground cover whose flowers attract a number of pollinators. Dill is a close relative of our prairie parsley, so we see a number of butterflies and other pollinators using it. Oregano, society garlic, rosemary, beautiful blooms on there that attract a number of pollinators. I mentioned creeping thyme. Cilantro is another one that has beautiful blooms when it's cold outside right now. And then, when it goes to seed, you can actually use the seeds as well, which are a spice. A number of our alliums. So alliums are onions and garlic. Some of them have purple blooms, pink blooms, white blooms, but are just fantastic for pollinators, as well as you can put them on a baked potato or use them in a vichyssoise, which is kind of a soup people eat this type of year. But any way you would use chives, you can use those alliums. Another great plant, a perennial that is it's the only herb, really traditional herb that's native to North America, has beautiful blooms. Are great for bees and butterflies alike. They're kind of just wrapping up their blooming time now. Fantastic ornamental edible. Also look for a lot of your herbs that are variegated, which just means that they have bicolor leaves, typically with yellows and whites along with the green. There's apple mint, oregano, and marjoram that are variegated. There's bicolor and tricolor sages that you would use for your Thanksgiving turkey, and then some variegated thymes. Now, a lot of these are not as cold hardy as they're kind of solid green leaf cousins, so make sure you put these in a protected area, and then just know you may have to replant some of these every 2 or 3 years, but that's okay. There's also a great variegated plant that I mentioned earlier. This is not a true allium, but a lot of people don't realize that it is an edible as well, but this is the variegated society garlic, one of my favorites. Now let's transition to some weird plants, some kind of outliers that you may not think about as edible as we're extending our palates. Mexican mint marigold blooms this time of year is fantastic. It's a lot of times it's called Texas tarragon, actually not native to Texas, native to Mexico, but a relative of our marigolds as well as our French tarragon. And I think it has a superior flavor. I love to use the leaves in chicken this time of year. It's also great for cocktails. You can use the leaves and the flowers, which have a sweet licorice. I don't like the taste of licorice, black licorice, but it's more of a mild kind of anise type of flavor to it. But again, if you have some monarchs coming through, this is kind of a great stop sign for them, as well as many of our native bees will utilize that plant. Now, I mentioned our edible powder. You can use edible flowers and other interesting edible plants that you may have not thought of as kind of traditional vegetables or fruits to help your garden look the best it can year-round. You can also feed pollinators at the same time. So marigolds, zinnias, pansies, and dianthus that we should be planting this time of year, those all happen to be edible flowers that attract pollinators as well, in addition to the Mexican tarragon we talked about and calendula. Now, I do want to give just a quick warning here. Plants have non-edible or toxic lookalikes. Always refer to the botanical name when you're verifying whether a plant is safe to eat. There's some great books out there. This is one of my first is Edible and Useful Plants of Texas by Delaney. You can check reference books for that, or you can also look at websites. Foraging Texas is a great one. Eat the Weeds, that is another great one. Wildman Steve Britt made news foraging in Central Park, which I got to do a couple of years ago. It was a lot of fun. Hunger and Thirst for Life is a blog where a younger couple kind of actually cooks more forage, kind of urban foraging, and utilizes the recipe. Always want to avoid eating any plant that's been sprayed with any synthetic chemicals or pesticides. Also look, if plants have heavy traffic or heavy metals, whether that's cars or lead paint or something nearby. Just look in the environment, make sure you're making the right choices. I will say, many plants at the grocery store have been sprayed with synthetic, insecticides and pesticides as well. So just kind of take that with a grain of salt, but always want to keep that in mind before you put anything in your mouth. And just know that many plants do have non-edible or toxic lookalikes. So you want to kind of set yourself up for success. The other thing when you're eating things in the landscape, whether those are traditional vegetables or they are edible landscape plants or plants that do have edible value that you kind of always have thought about as a traditional ornament item. So first thing, you want to identify it. Know exactly what the plant is before you consider eating it. Just like vegetables in our garden, we know that there's a time of year to harvest, and sometimes when it's past its peak, it's not good. We know there's certain parts of the plant that we can eat. So with rhubarb, we know that we can eat the stem, but not the other part of the plant. The other part of the plant is toxic, so that could be the same with other plants. We'll talk about some kind of moving forward, like Yopon holly. It has a mildly toxic red berry, but the leaves are used for caffeinated tea, similar to the American yerba mate. Now, also think about the environment. You're not going to be harvesting dandelion greens from the dog bark, but, in your own side yard or backyard where the dog doesn't have access to, that may be something that you want to think about. And then method of pet preparation. Certainly there are plants at the grocery store that are toxic if we eat them raw, like beans is one of those. So we want to actually cook them or use the method of preparation where, it's safest for us to eat, and also tastiest for us to eat. So where would you look for some of these plants? I promise we'll dig into here in the next couple of slides. Your own backyard, so you could, if that's conventional vegetables, fruits, nuts, edible flowers, trees. You can also eat the weeds. Nearby meadows or abandoned lots. I find wild foods there all the time. Near streams, parks, green belts, trails, pretty much everywhere. I can't walk, 50 feet without finding plants that actually have edible value. I will say, though, that you have to ask permission. So one thing that I plan to do tomorrow is I have a neighbor who has a huge black walnut. The black walnuts are littering their front yard. I'm just going to go knock on the door, stay 6 feet away with my mask on, and just say, hey, I know this sounds crazy, but can I harvest your black walnuts? And I would say 99% of the time, people give me funny looks, and then they say, oh, sure, no problem. So one that you can do that with is our Mexican plum. In fact, I planted a Mexican plum in my front yard. It's a great ornamental plant, but it also produces edible fruits that are delicious. I actually just made some Mexican plum vinegar yesterday with some kind of pits and peels that are left over from making jelly. But it's great for our pollinators. It's native to Texas. It's drought tolerant, and you can eat the fruit. So what is not to love about that? Another edible plant that you may be familiar with in your landscape is the redbud, which produces in the spring edible flowers that taste exactly like a pea because it's in the pea family, and it is the larval host of one of our butterflies, which has an amazing, beautiful caterpillar. And this is what they look like when they're blooming. Young buds and flower pods can be used in salads. You can cook them generally spring and the fall. And if you get in the first few days, these pods, they taste exactly like a green bean. Now, another plant that is very common in our urban areas that is producing fruit right now is the hackberry, one of the first ingredients in pemmican, if you've heard about that kind of trail snack. And to me, it tastes like fruit roll-ups. If you imagine, when you're a kid, what that tastes like, it's also the larval host of the question mark butterfly, the morning cloak, as well as the American snout. There's also a Texas persimmon. I mentioned persimmons earlier, the Japanese persimmon that are bigger and oranger. This one is a very ornamental plant with exfoliating bark. In the summer, it produces these kind of dark black fruit, which I think are delicious if you let them ripen, or you can use them in jellies. And a lot of other mammals utilize those too, so that wildlife, butterflies and native bees and flies using them as a nectar source. And it's also the larval host of the gray hair streak. Now, our American persimmon, and these that there are some that I'm harvesting right now. In fact, I'll give you a tip. So I actually went to Dallas Community College, a college. Across the street is Richland Park, and there's probably 40 American persimmons there. So Google it, look it up, and you can go harvest some right now if you want. As well as in the gardens at Richland, there is a large Japanese persimmon that's fruiting right now. Now you got to get permission to harvest from that one probably, but it's 30 foot tall, just delicious plant. So they are ripe. So oft is overripe banana. Think that they're overripe, that's when you have to eat them. If you eat them when they're crisp, They're very astringent and tannic and make your mouth feel like it's kind of covered in hairs, and you only make that mistake once. Diospyros is the genus here, which means fruit of the gods, and I think that that is a great sentiment because the flavor is so good. It also happens to be the larval host of a Luna moth in your landscape, or utilize the ones that are kind of around nearby. And these are some that I harvested about a couple miles from my house, and I'm actually in the process of making jelly as well, some preserves. Chickabin oak is an oak that is indigenous to our area that's actually named after another plant called the chickabin that has a more edible nut. But you can actually eat the nuts on the chickabin oaks, but you have to process those and leach some of the tannins out. But if you do that, you really get kind of a sweet acorn flower, and you can read more about that online or ask me questions on social media. I apologize for going so fast here. Cenizo or Texas sage is a plant that's near and dear to my heart, that is very beneficial to a number of our pollinators. But this time of year when people are getting colds, they actually use a tea made from the leaves to help fight congestion, fever, and coughing. And there's more information on that online. But of course, I'm not a doctor, so anytime you're using any plants for medical use, you always want to consult your doctor and any medical sources to make sure that wouldn't, cause any issues with your diet or any of your medical conditions. Another plant that is great for pollinators and delicious for us are the purple passion vine. This is our native passion vine. I have a few different cultivars of these growing in my backyard, but they're the host species of the Molt Mexican and Gold fritillary. In addition, here, wait till the fruit is wrinkled. It has to wrinkle down just a little bit, or sometimes it will drop off the plant and open it up. And this is a close relative of the passion fruit that gives high C its flavor, or different fruit punch drinks. I absolutely love the flavor of this, and I'm going to try and go forward some that weren't ready this weekend with local chef Justin Bach. So, hey, Justin, I don't know if he's listening, but we went to high school together, and he's going to try and do some amazing things with this native fruit. There are some native grasses that do have some edible value. One of those is inland oats. Now, the chaff makes up of the outer coating of the seed, so it's hard to get out of. But some folks are actually experimenting with this to get the fermentable sugars and making the beer. Great, it's a host of the skipper butterflies, and other mammals will use that as well. So even if you don't eat it, it's got some benefit. Most people know of echinacea, purple coneflower. In addition to being a great nectar source for our pollinators, it can also be used as a herbal supplement, which a lot of folks have taken advantage of. Another plant that you may be familiar with is a cousin of the Szechuan pepper, used a lot in Szechuan Chinese cuisine to help kind of numb the hot and spicy dishes. Xanthoxylum is a genus, two native trees, and you can use the husk of the seed that is ground down and used as Szechuan pepper, which again shares the same genus as the traditional Szechuan pepper, but is a larval host of the eastern giant swallowtail, which they call the bird poop caterpillar, for being crass. But the insect at the larval stage, actually, a lot of times people think that it looks like bird frass, and then, of course, grows up to be one of our most beautiful native butterflies. In our area, there's 3 or 4 different sumacs that we can find here that produce clusters of berries. But the outer kind of hairs on those are used to season foods. You may have heard that spice called sumac, a lot of times sprinkled over hummus and fattoush and baba ganoush and different Mediterranean dishes, but is kind of fading right now, although I just found some, I guess, this past weekend. It still had some of the hairs on there that you can actually just kind of grind off and then use to powder and give that kind of citrusy flavor. Now is prime time to harvest pecans, whether those are improved pecans that are grown to be larger and have a thinner shell, or our native pecans that tend to have superior taste. They're just a harder nut to crack, if you will. Larval host of different hair-streaked butterflies, of course, are very beneficial to birds and mammals. insects, and are great for pumpkin pie, or not pumpkin pies. Well, you could do a pumpkin pecan pie, but great for pecan pies. Black walnuts. I mentioned wanting to go harvest some of these today, but absolutely love this nut. It's a relative of our pecan. It looks like a lime when it's growing on the tree and has this husk on the outer side that kind of fades to black, similar to the outside of a pecan. And it is a harder nut to crack, so you have to get inside that shell. But if you do, the meat of the nut is fantastic. To me, it tastes like a cross between a pecan and a pine nut. So definitely worth the trouble to get into there. It is, used as a landscape tree, even though it does have some of the same challenges as pecans, where it loses limbs in a storm and sometimes can look a little straggly. But in terms of nuts that we can grow here, excuse me, is really a productive plant. And this is what they actually look like. I know that's not super appetizing now with that husk breaks down, but if you crack into it, this is actually what the meat looks like and is as delicious as any nut-like fruit that you've eaten traditionally. I mentioned a number of pond hollies that grow in our landscapes, whether those are dwarf or traditional, the weeping form that we see in the background here. But these are a relative of the South American yaupon that is used in the tea yerba mate. And this is the only plant that I'm aware of in North America that actually has caffeine in the leaves. So you can use this as a coffee or a tea substitute. In fact, it's becoming a trend. It's made national news a few times in the past few years. Now, the red berries are mildly toxic. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just definitely wouldn't eat those, but the leaves are edible. You can roast those in an oven, roast them on lower temperatures and a longer period of time if you want more of a green tea, or you can roast those a little bit longer if you want more of a black tea, and you can mix them with cream or sugar, whatever honey you do. I mentioned they made some national. So NPR did a story on that about 5 years ago. There's also a Texas company there's a number of Texas companies actually now. There's one out of Houston, one out of Pedernales, that Cat's upon. You can buy this, look for like your specialty grocery stores, and you can make green tea with a native that has caffeine in it. So it's kind of win-win there. Another plant that's interesting that is, in addition to being a native plant that grows in wild areas, it's a common landscape plant. In fact, I have some just kind of right behind me on this back wall in an area that has full sun against shade. And as a kind of background hedge or background shrubs that is evergreen, there's not a lot that will thrive in high light conditions and low light conditions and kind of give you kind of an even feel through that transition of light. And wax myrtle is one of those. There's a form that grows more like a tree in the form of crepe myrtle, and then a dwarf that is kind of 4 foot by 4 foot or so. But the leaves are called Cajun oregano. In fact, one of the most common shrimp boils, like the box that you would use to boil shrimp and crabs, actually has wax myrtle as the ingredient there, so you can use that in that respect. It's also can be substituted if you don't have bay leaves. You can substitute wax myrtle leaves in any soup or stew dish. It is the larval host of butterflies. The fruits are kind of waxed by birds and other small mammals, nectar source for bees and butterflies. And then if you've ever heard of a bayberry kale, this is actually a cousin of the plant that grows in the east. You can actually make a wax from the berries if you're so inclined. I haven't done it myself, but certainly it is something that people do. And people think about those candles kind of having the smell of Christmas, and that's wax comes from. American beautyberry, I was just harvesting some of these berries myself yesterday. In fact, they arise right on the stem of the plant, magenta, beautiful, beautiful landscape plants, also native here to North Texas. You can eat the berries when completely ripe. They're sweet, mildly sweetish. It really depends on the shrub where you're harvesting it from. but kind of floral notes, like if you've ever had rose water or any desserts that have infused roses in them, kind of similar to that. So really interesting flavors and jellies and syrups, which I made a couple of years ago now. And this is actually a syrup, which is what I call a jelly that doesn't set up. So I had a problem going from powdered pectin to liquid pectin. And the syrup actually ended up being better than the jelly and more, what's the word I'm looking for? It was more versatile in the sometimes your failures turn into successes. Also beautiful when it blooms in the spring, and almost more than any plant in my landscape, I was shocked to see the small inconspicuous flowers on the American beautyberry attract such a diversity of pollinators, but they're all very, very small because the flowers are small. Autumn sage, which blooms this type of year, there's a number of them. Traditionally, these Mexican cuisine for seasoning black beans, also a nectar source for butterflies and hummingbirds and other bees. The flowers are edible. I would pull the sepal off, so the very base of the plant, and eat the white part. It's sweet. And if you eat the top part, it's more floral, but sometimes it can be a little bitter, but great, in cocktails and in salads. Turk's cap is another great landscape plant, a native wild that has beautiful blooms, hibiscus blooms. They taste kind of like a crisp cucumber. Nectar source for butterflies and hummingbirds. And then it does produce a fruit this time of year called a Turk's apple, which have historically been used to make a jelly. Another plant that is just kind of wrapping up its bloom time is the liatris. A number of liatris actually produce an edible corm that you can use like a potato. Now, don't go digging up native liatris, because if you digging up the plant, that wouldn't come back next year. But if you have some of these that are kind of spread in your landscape, this may be something that you want to do more research and see how you can eat that and prepare. Wrapping up the season where it produces its pods and you can use in a flower. And I'm going to kind of wrap up so we have time to get questions. If you want to read more about the honey mesquite pods and how you can make a diabetic lotion, and sifted that down, and there's pictures of that process. But a fantastic flower that you can use for plants that a lot of people call a weed. Now, another plant that people call a weed a lot is the lyre leaf sage, one of our native Texas sages, and the entirety of that flower in the mint family. Flowers have a little bit of a taste of the mint there, but is a great nectar source for butterflies and bees as well. Oh, we've talked about some edible flowers, but in addition to finding edible flowers in your landscape, right now you can find goldenrod, which is the edible flower that has been used in teas and tinctures and has kind of a licorice type flavor. It's also a beautiful ornamental plant that you could decorate the Thanksgiving table with. Or dewberries or wild blackberries have a great floral, kind of sweet tasting hint of blackberry that you could use for teas or to decorate desserts or use, in salad. Prickly pear produces an edible fruit and an edible flower. Primrose was one of the first plants used at the first Thanksgiving. It produces an edible flower as well as an edible tuber that Native Americans took advantage of. Violets, or native wood violets, are blooming this time of year, also edible in the flowers and the leaves. And then black locust is a really interesting member of the pea family that blooms in the spring. And then this time of year, you can make a syrup from the pods. In fact, it was an ingredient in the first beer that was made in North America, along with yarrow and horehounds, and then the wax myrtle that we talked about. So the North American beer utilized those. Kind of interesting. So kind of just wrapping up, in conclusion, if you want to attract wildlife to your landscape, certainly it puts us back in touch with the land we live on, the people around us. So if you want to attract bees or butterflies, hummingbirds, songbirds, some of our native reptiles, create a habitat for them by providing a food source, which many times you can do through plants, a water source, so some type of supplemental water that could be rocks or downed limbs or just the plants themselves. And if you do that, in addition to, creating these natural feeding areas, maybe feeding birds, which you can find more information at Audubon, Texas, creating a layered approach with different plants with the tallest around the edge, layered shorter, closer to your home, creating kind of these shelter areas, an all-season color or cover that incorporates some thorny plants, different food, berry, seed-producing plants, then really you've created a landscape that wildlife, in addition to our mammals and birds, but our pollinators are going to want to call home. Now, I am running out of time, and I want to leave time for questions on the page, which is Texas Plant Guy. And you can go and find all the information about the new perennial movement, incorporating grasses into your landscape, all the trends we've talked about, certifying your landscapes for wildlife habitat, reviewing all these plants that attract pollinators. You can find that on that Facebook page, or the Sustainability Summit has recorded this presentation, and so you can go back and you can watch it there. And feel free to reach out to me on any of the social media platforms at TX Plant Guy, and I would be more than happy to answer your. Do we have time for, and do we have any questions in the chat?
We do have 5 minutes, Daniel, before everybody's going to sign out and head to their next session. Does anybody have any questions? Not seeing any in the Q&A at the moment. But remind us, Daniel, if you would, where we can find you online and at what times on the ranch.
So we do once a month. We do a segment on Saturday mornings on the ranch with Liz Rudd. Also, we do a segment on CBS, and so right now you can go to cbsdfw.com. Today is Texas Arbor Day, and we did a segment about 2 more. I'm also going to be on Texas Today, which is the mid-morning segment for NBC, our local NBC affiliate, KXAS. And that will be next Tuesday at 1. We're shooting that, and so you can look for that one. We're talking around as well as talks last month, and you can find those both on those respected news channels. You can find all of those segments and all of the articles that I've written at texasplantguide.com or on my social media, which you just type in TX Plant Guide there, and those will pop up.
Very good. Daniel, we appreciate your expertise and your time today. And everyone else, enjoy the rest of your sessions. Again, Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and y'all have a great Texas Arbor Day.
Thanks. Bye-bye, you too.